Tonight we're talking trade with some of our industry's leading experts. And joining me on the set tonight are Phil Singh, President and CEO of the Meat Export Federation, Greg Dowd, Chief Economist with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and Brett Stewart, Market Analyst for Cattle Facts. Thanks so much for joining us, gentlemen. Phil, I want to talk with you on the first day, really, of January. We sent a trade delegation to China to meet with the Chinese in advance of the President's visit here to the United States in hopes of opening beef trade. Why have we not heard any announcement about that? What's going on there?
Well, I think that is perplexing. I think you had a delegation in Beijing for 11 days. They came home without any discernible results. We do understand that there was some progress made on many of the technical issues that still are surmountable, but insurmountable as far as these discussions were concerned. But I do believe that there was progress made, but it was not able to be made in time for the Hu Jintao visit when he visited Washington, D.C. for the state visit. So sometimes in international trade, those milestones, those key points when people are coming to like a special meeting or state visit, those are areas where people like to have a lot of these issues resolved, and we missed a very important time with that.
Brett, China is an important trading partner of the U.S. How big are China's imports broadly across agriculture? And secondly, what would the Chinese market mean to beef and the beef industry were we to open it up?
Well, if you just look at U.S. ag exports to China, we're likely going to export about $16 billion worth of U.S. ag products this year. That's triple what we exported in 2005.
Hold on just a second. You know what? We're going to come back to you after we get a mic. Greg, I want to follow up with you and talk just a little bit about BSE and what that means. It's been 7 years since that thing tore up our export markets, and we still don't have access to China. We have limited access to Japan and several other markets. Are folks working on our behalf back in Washington, D.C. to make something happen?
You know, there's some fatigue on this, but they really are. As Phil said, we had a huge delegation that spent a lot of time in China. They are very well aware of the issues in Japan. We're working on getting the Korean FTA passed. But I think what we also see is that, you know, in today's climate with food inflation and everything else going on, there's a lot of interest at a commercial level in the private sector. But our government and other governments around the world really have a hard time talking with each other to get these issues resolved. And that's really the challenge that we have going forward, is getting governments more involved in our industry to get these things fixed.
Brett, let's go back to you and try that again. So tell us about the size of exports to China and what it would mean to the beef industry if we could get that market open up.
U.S. agriculture products going to China this year will likely surpass $16 billion. That's triple what it was just 5 years ago. China has now surpassed Mexico and Japan to become our #2 ag market for U.S. products. It will likely become #1 in the next year or so. Today, if you look and say, what could we do with beef? We're shipping about $15 million worth of U.S. pork a month to China. You look at the potential, I would say if we were to get access, we could probably ship somewhere 150 million pounds of U.S. beef to China the first 12 months. The real question is, what are we shipping year 5 and year 10?
Well, and as we talk about some of these key agricultural export markets, 2010, even notwithstanding the fact that we're locked out of some of those markets, has been a phenomenal year for U.S. agriculture. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the top markets for agricultural products globally?
Yeah, looking at 2010, you know, we don't have official data through December, but we're likely going to export about $4 billion worth of U.S. beef and beef variety meats. That will be a new record, more than we've ever shipped, even before BSE. And you look at the growth in 2010, it was fueled largely by the Asian region. Look at a country like Korea. The economy took off. The Korean economy likely surpassed most other global economies in 2010. Demand took off. We'll have about 270 million pounds of beef to Korea last year. The Asian region overall, if you consider Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, all those areas are up 20, 30, 40% year over year. And it's hard to see that when we sit here under a recession in the U.S. and realize some of these economies are doing very well around the globe.
That's a great point. And speaking of around the globe, Phil, you have a lot of bright people that work for you. In fact, had the privilege of being at a wedding of one of those bright young ladies that worked for you about a week ago. Tell us about these folks, and more importantly, what are some of the plans you have for 2011 around the world?
Well, we have 60 people basically working for us around the globe. We're basically working in almost 100 countries around the world out of about 15 offices. We're working heavily right now. As you know, Mexico is our #1 market for beef, and we have a lot of activities going on in Mexico. I think one of the major areas, of course, that we've had concern where we still have some access issues would be still with Japan, also with Korea. So we've developed a We Care campaign in Japan, a To Trust campaign in Korea, and I think we've done very, very well. You know, going back to what Brett said, you know, after we had BSE, that knocked us back to the export levels of 1985. And in just the last 5 years, since we've really had some meaningful access to these markets, we've eclipsed what we did in the last 5 years, what it took us 18 years to accomplish before. So it's really phenomenal what we've been able to do, and a lot of our staff and of course a lot of people in the industry, they all deserve the credit for this.
Yeah. Despite some delays and barriers in Washington, D.C. So Greg, I want to come back to you. You live in our nation's capital. What is your sense of this new Congress, and what is it going to mean to our ability to move trade forward faster, specifically as it relates to wrapping up this Korean Free Trade Agreement?
Well, I think one of the things we figured out with this new Congress early on is trade is hot, again, in Washington. I think they really understand how strong some of these economies are around the world. The Korean FTA has gotten a lot of play from the President's State of the Union. I think Congress is very interested in moving that thing forward as quickly as we can, and around the world right now, Korea is probably the hottest economy on the planet. So I think there's a lot of recognition that with the value of the dollar low, this is kind of a golden era for us in U.S. agriculture to get busy and begin to take advantage of those opportunities in export markets.
Phil, I wanted to come back to you and ask you a question about food inflation. You know, read an article suggested that the IMF food index is up 25% this year. What does that mean to U.S. agriculture?
Well, I think it's very important to U.S. agriculture. Number one is, when I first started many years ago in this international area, you know, everybody was concerned about imports. They were very concerned about their own food security, and food self-sufficiency. And now food security has become very important. And I think if you look at China, you look at Korea, you look at all these markets, and especially since BSE, there's a huge concern internationally about where will we be able to procure the products that we need for the future. And I think this has become something very symbolic when you take a look at even what's going on in the Middle East with Tunisia, also with Egypt, with other countries. I know China is obsessed with security, and for every individual in any country you go to, food is the first thing they're going to see where there's inflation or where there's shortages. And so maintaining a good, viable food supply is critical to any regime staying in power, and that's becoming more tantamount as we go forward in the future.
Boy, it's been real clear the last couple of weeks.
You better believe it.
BSE, let me come back to that. Phil, you've mentioned it. Greg, you've talked about it. Brett, I want to put you on the hot spot. Your organization has tried to quantify what it's cost the U.S. beef industry. What are your estimates?
Well, that's a real challenging question, Kevin. You know, we talk about cost, and costs are wide-ranging and widespread. I guess if you just talk in terms of value, what has this industry lost? What have beef producers lost? Over the last 7 years, we estimate those losses to be just over $20 billion. That's with a B. $20 billion. We're looking at roughly $2.9 billion a year. We've averaged the last 7 years because of not having access. We continue to lose that money. Now, you can look at those losses and purvey them out through the industry, and not just the industry. You look at what it's cost consumers. You look at what it's cost consumers in Japan, as they've had to pay exorbitant prices for beef the last 7 years. The costs are really hard to even begin to quantify. It may be 5 times that, it might be 10 times that. But for the industry, that's a pretty painful loss to bear.
And let me follow up just in exports in general. Brett, you get around to a lot of meetings, talk to a lot of producers. I know both you and Greg have active interest in livestock operations yourselves. Do you think producers' attitudes towards exports are changing? What are you hearing when you're visiting with folks?
Well, you know, there's a lot of emotion when we talk about trade. I think there are people in the industry that truly get it. We've got people that are plugged in with these good organizations of USMEF and National Cattlemen's. Those guys that are plugged in and attuned, I think they get it, but as an industry, I don't think we're there yet. I look at some of the things that we're unwilling to do, some of the infighting we have over trade, You know, trade's not a threat to us. Trade's an enormous opportunity. And to speak really frankly, to be totally honest, I don't think even us sitting at this table get it. When we look at how big these opportunities can be for us, we see these food inflation riots around the world. We see our dollar position. Our beef remains enormously competitive around the globe. The sky's the limit. You know, we don't want to draw off of just dollars in the U.S. where consumers are under recession. We want to draw off of dollars from consumers that have good economies. We want to really expand that base of money coming into this industry far beyond our own borders.
But Greg, what do you say to folks who say, you know what, this export deal is too hard, there's too many hoops to jump through, and it's too risky for me in the industry? What do you say to folks like that?
Well, it is hard. There is no question about it, as we've discussed the difficulty we've had. But, you know, 96% of our customers are outside of this country. That's the old cliche, but it's true. And we've got as many middle-class consumers today in China as we have in consumers in the United States. This is where the new money comes from for our industry. Short plates, outside skirts, chuck rolls, bone-in short ribs are not things that you see at Outback Steakhouse. These are things that we've specialized in our ability to export. This is where we're going to, and actually is driving what we're doing right now, and we've got to have, as you've heard tonight, more opportunities are out there if we can just get busy in working with government and around the world to get them done and get those for us.
So despite this volatility and uncertainty, you're still suggesting this is a time to look towards expansion?
It is, but let me be clear. We are going to see enormous volatility, given the types of economics we have going on around the world these days. There's uncertainty everywhere, but you've got to continue to work hard and push, and that means working in Washington. Phil and the guys overseas working. It takes a constant effort to do this, but it's certainly worth it, and we have to do it.
Thank you, gentlemen, Phil, Greg, and Brett, for all your insight tonight. We really appreciate that.
Our pleasure.
Thanks, Kevin.
For more information on the U.S. Meat Export Federation and NCBA or Cattle Facts, visit cattlemen.org.